Where does the voice of your inner critic come from? Discovering your origin of the voice inside provides a tangible way to begin healing and find your way forward. Learning to reframe your mindset to use the tools that trauma and your negative experiences taught you will help tap into your leadership skills hidden within. Who knew? I'm Dr. Jessica Metcalf, and this is Speak Kindly, You're Listening. Don't forget to check out the book with the same name that inspired it all, out on Amazon, and is now a bestseller. With me today is Deborah Ancona, Seeley Distinguished Professor of Management, a Professor of Organization Studies, and the founder of the MIT Leadership Center at the MIT Sloan School of Management. She's also the author of X Teams, How to Build Teams That Lead, Innovate, and Succeed, and is also a contributor to multiple articles on leadership and self-awareness for the Harvard Business Review. On today's episode, Deborah discusses generational ghosts, using your past experiences to propel you to new heights, and how the road to healing is not so simple, but totally worth it. Here we go. Deborah, I was reading the article around family ghosts in the executive suite, and it is so fascinating when we think about our inner critic because we can bring it to the now and think, okay, this inner critic is stuck with us and this is what it's saying to us. But that inner critic definitely has ghosts from the past. So tell me a little bit about how our inner critic relates to those family ghosts.
Sure. Well, let me go back a step and say, what are family ghosts? So family ghosts are those things from our host family, our family of origin that stay with us. They might be beliefs about things or the shoulds in our world. You should do this, you should do that. It might be roles that you play. If you're in a particular role in your family, you're the rebel or you're the genius. You keep some of the vestiges of those roles. Those are the things you're most comfortable with because that's what you grew up doing. That's what you grew up hearing. Those are the shoulds, the roles. Sometimes it's about secrets. There are things that in your family you weren't supposed to talk about. And so even now to this day, some of those ghosts follow us. Not all of them, but some of them do. And many people focus really on trauma of childhood and trauma of growing up. I don't like to think of it that way. I like to think that we have both good ghosts and bad ghosts because some of the things we learned while navigating our family system are very helpful. They're good. Maybe we had an alcoholic family, and so you think of it as horrible. But a lot of, at least my students who come from alcoholic families, there's a lot of good in there. Not that you'd want to repeat the experience, but that what comes out of it is grit and resilience. You can deal with a lot of difficult things. What comes out of it is you created some form of mastery. You mastered that environment, whether it's through studying hard or learning how to retreat or things like sense making. You know how to read a room because when you came home, you had to figure out, okay, what's going on? Is it safe for me here? Is it not safe for me? How am I going to navigate? And so a lot of people who come from that kind of family are great sense makers. They're great at diagnosing a situation. So there are good ghosts as well as bad ghosts. It may be that you're not trusting. And so it's very hard to delegate because you don't trust people. Again, there are good ghosts and bad ghosts, but the ghosts are the things that stay with us, those patterns that we learned and experienced that are comfortable for us, that stay with us into the current day. Okay, critic, where does the critic come in? Sometimes that critic, you talk a lot about speak kindly, you're listening, that's you talking to yourself. But where did that critic come from? Very often that inner critic comes from, it's a family voice. In your case, it was your father's voice. It might be your mother's voice. It might be a sibling. In psychology today, people think that the role of siblings has been underplayed. It's always the mom who is doing something or the parents, but siblings play an active role. Oh, you're such a sore loser. Oh, you're the reject kid or whatever. Those critic voices are vestiges of our family system, but we've taken them on. We've owned them. And the good news about that is that you can become aware of what your inner critic is saying and start to replace it with other things that you can tell yourself.
I love breaking it down just the way that you did because it gives us tangible ways to interpret that inner critic instead of just assuming, oh my goodness, it's one more negative thing that we've said about ourselves. And why can't I change that voice? But the way that you've just outlined it gives people that opportunity to be able to go back and say, okay, well, this voice just didn't come out of nowhere. It started from somewhere. And this gives me the opportunity to look back at those family ghosts. Now, talk to me about the difference about, because I think the word trauma has been really overused and abused in the last few years. And so, talk to me a little bit about how we can shift away from trying to figure out if trauma is the right word that we should be using or if it's not. Because I know I've worked with some of my clients who they've said, well, that's not trauma. And I said, well, that was a really difficult experience or event that happened in your life. You may not want to label it as trauma, but we can still call it a spade at the end of the day. So, talk to me about that word trauma.
Yeah. So the reason that I don't like the word trauma is exactly what you just said. It's overused. So all of us have had difficult experiences growing up, even as grown-ups. We live in an exponentially changing world. You don't always know what to do. You're going to make some decisions that are wrong. You're going to have bosses that are mean. You're going to have made a mistake somewhere along the line with a friend or a spouse or something. And that's going to be a difficult experience. A difficult experience is not traumatic. Often traumatic means that you're unable to process it. You're unable to cope with it. It's so bad that your system has shut down. It's so bad that you perhaps pushed it away somewhere and can't deal with it. You might need help dealing with it because it just has taken all of your ways of coping and shut them down. So I tend to think of trauma as far on the list of things that are negative. The other thing I don't like about trauma, even as a label, is that it makes it sound like there's nothing you can do about it. I was traumatized. And so because of the work that I do with my students, and this is not therapist work, this is just working with executives, I have seen some family systems where there's a label of, well, we had a trauma and so we can't do this. But then if you keep labeling it as we were traumatized, and so you keep going back to what you can't do, what the damage was, and all of the work on positive psychology and the work that we do in trying to change is figuring out a way forward. And so a lot of the reframe is something bad happened to me, but it doesn't have to rule my life. It doesn't mean that it always has to be there. Something about trauma is it always has to be there. And again, there's always the push on trauma is bad, but what came out of you from that trauma that we can work with here? Because it's part of who you are and it is a form of resilience. You went to the very bottom and you showed yourself that you can survive. You showed yourself that you have skills to claw out, and you want to keep that mindset going rather than just sticking with this happened to me and I'm stuck.
What comes out of those moments in time when we can look back and finally see them as good ghosts? Because initially, depending on how we're processing, we may label it as a bad ghost. And then as it starts to come
You
through,
can also say a good ghost and a bad ghost.
love it. Because it can be both. Why does it have to be either or? Exactly.
Right. Yes, there are good ghosts that came out of it, and then there are terrible ghosts that came out of it. It's not that we want to whitewash over the fact that there are negative things that came out of that experience. Yes, but let's just not stay there and sink into it.
For the individual who has an inner gremlin, I want to go to the example that you used where that resilience came out and that person who came from a background where they had to assess their environment on a consistent basis as a kid growing up into their teenage years or whatever that looked like for that individual. And that gave them an immense skill to be able to walk into companies and assess their environments, whether it's assessing clients or team members or colleagues and whatever that looks like. I don't think we acknowledge those skills as strongly because they're not the quote unquote hard skill or technical skill. So for the person whose inner gremlin starts to become really loud and say, well, that doesn't count, what would you say to that person?
I would say that, in fact, I do a lot of research on leadership and what are the leadership capabilities that most matter in leadership effectiveness. And interestingly, all the capabilities that we've identified are important, but one of the capabilities that's most important is what is called sense making. Sense making is termed by Carl Weick, who was a professor at the University of Michigan. He's written many books on sense making. I've also written many articles on sense making if any of your readership is interested. But sense making is all about making sense of the context in which you're operating, making sense of what's going on there. So that ability to go in and read the room, the ability to go out and understand your environment, the ability to know what are the threats to your environment, what are the opportunities in your environment, that is a super skill. That is a super leadership skill. And not only that, but your ability to do sense making, really understand and map what's happening in my environment is related to your ability to vision the future. Visioning is a big part of leadership. If you understand what is right now, you're able to envision the future. If you're able to do a great job of sense making, then you are better able to execute because you know who's supporting me, who's not supporting me, how do I talk to these people, how do I not? And so your ability to execute is much better. And people trust you more when you know how to do sense making because it's a crazy world out there. Somebody who understands what's going on and can communicate that is seen as trustworthy. Oh, this person knows how to navigate these troubled waters. If your inner critic is saying that's not important, you need to say, oh, well, you know what? Research coming out of top universities in the world says otherwise.
Yeah, I love that. That's an amazing reframe right there because that inner gremlin needs those facts to like prove it that what it's saying, especially when we attach our emotions and some of those heavy emotions that come with it. In that article, what I love that stands out is some ghosts make you resilient and are the pillars of your success. Celebrate and build on them. And we said that you don't have to necessarily look at it as a bad ghost or a good ghost. It can be both. And when you give yourself the permission to celebrate and build on them, that allows you to continue to grow, even that sense making aspect. Now, we always talk about at times don't be overly confident, don't celebrate too much at times because then what's that going to look like? So people think that a part of their inner gremlin about tearing themselves down is keeping them humble. What are your thoughts around that?
I think that people who are legitimately humble and ask questions and see the world as I can grow and learn from other people, and I'm not the be all and end all on the planet, are probably not as likely to fall prey to, oh, I'm becoming going to become a conceited egomaniac. And it's the people who are the toxic, narcissistic leaders of the world who are more likely to think that they're God's gift to the universe and to not be scared of overhearing positive things and to overinflate their sense of capacity. So if you're one of those people who's generally more on the humble scale, I wouldn't worry about celebrating too much. I think it's good to pat yourself on the back and say, good job. So good job, I mean, just means good job. It doesn't mean I'm the best thing since sliced bread. It just means let's just celebrate, make it a short term celebration, not a long term something about you that is always great. And then celebrate to your heart's content. Isn't it nice to celebrate and move on? The other thing is, I mean, there's a fair amount of research that suggests that having some imposter syndrome, some of that, I'm not good enough, is helpful. Some of it is helpful because you feel slightly inadequate, you're overcompensating. You're trying to work harder and do a better job. You're going to do more of that sense making because you want to understand what's expected. All of these things, and that's why it's kind of difficult. All of these things are some is good and too much is not good. If you never feel good in a situation, if you're always feeling like you're an imposter and can't sit there and feel like, yes, I belong here. Yes, I'm good enough some of the time, then that's a danger signal. But occasionally thinking, I'm not sure, so let me work harder. Again, as long as it doesn't move into your terminology of perfectionist notion, I have to be perfect, that's when it's gone too far.
Mhm. I always have this debate with people around imposter syndrome in that sense because there's some people who are so adamant saying, well, you should have imposter syndrome. So then again, it keeps you humble or keeps you in your place at times. But then there's that tipping over where too much of something is not a good thing. And that person who ends up staying stuck or never applies for that job or never asks for a promotion or never really feels like they're good enough in multiple aspects of their life. And that's where it can become detrimental. And so I appreciate how you clarified that a little bit. And that gives us the opportunity to see us as a whole instead of just focusing on one aspect of something that we may not be good at. It's giving us the opportunity to be able to have a bird's eye view, which brings me into the other article that you wrote in praise of the incomplete leader.
Can I interrupt you for one
Of
second? Because I
course,
think there's one other piece on the imposter syndrome, and I'll
bring it on.
own example here is when I started teaching as a faculty member, I have to say I suffered from a huge amount of imposter syndrome. And I think it just got so exacerbated. I taught my first year with an older gentleman who was on a million boards, and he taught for 3 weeks. Then I was on for 3 weeks. And then another faculty member was on, and he was the cool guy with his motorcycle and his leather jacket. And so I just said, I'm not cool and I'm not on all these boards, so I'm not good enough. And so part of what we always focus on is, well, you have to find your own voice. Just because you're not this and you're not that, well, who can you be? And so your work is to craft a life that works for you. You know, with social media, we're always doing social comparison. Your thing is not, I'm not good enough and I'm not as good as this one and that one and the other. It's, well, find your own voice, find your own leadership signature and make it your own. And that's what's going to give you the confidence to go ahead. The other thing I would say is those early days of a huge amount of imposter syndrome, I spent so much time focused in my brain. Are they going to like me? Are they paying attention to me? What if I say this? How are they going to respond? So much in my brain. And that meant there was a huge amount of mental effort going into self monitoring, as opposed to now having done a lot of work to tamp down that inner critic. I just go in and I can focus more on what do I want to say and what's happening in the classroom and how are people responding and how can I move to the next stage. And it's not all about, can I do it? Am I doing this right? Am I doing this wrong? You're taking away a huge amount of mental work that pulls you away from being great at whatever you do, whether you're a mom or in a relationship or in a job. If you're constantly worrying about yourself, then it's much harder to put yourself into the situation. So any work that people can do to say, what is it that I bring to the table and how can I celebrate that? How can I feel good about what I do bring and not worry so much about what I'm not bringing?
Thank you for painting that picture about yourself early on. Because when we can see that imagery of you walking in and how you saw yourself in comparison to the other professor coming in on his motorcycle and what that looked like. And we create those perceptions ourselves. And it can be really easy to sit in that comparison. And social media, like you said, makes it really easy for us to consistently be comparing ourselves all the time. And as you started, I want to go back to that story. As you started to work through, and so the other professor was 3 weeks on, and then you were 3 weeks on. Were there ever any moments in time where you'd get up or you'd be in the middle of a lecture or whatever it was, and then all of a sudden you'd be thinking to yourself, oh, geez, what am I doing here? How am I supposed to keep this up when there's this other person that I keep comparing myself to?
Yeah, it's very hard. As I said, when that's what's going on, there's a huge amount of social comparison and a huge amount of social comparison where you see yourself as the negative one, the one who can't bring that to the table, you can get immobilized. It can completely take over. And so really reframing it is, how come I can't be like person A or person B, to how can I be the best version of who I am? How can I craft an identity that works for me with my personality and my strengths and my weaknesses and my value set? And that's what's going to really let me shine. I mean, just some things to think about. We do this with our executive coaching: is sit down and take out a piece of paper or write on a whiteboard. These are the things I'm really good at. So I'm really good at facilitating conversation. I'm really good at taking research material and having it come alive in an applied way. I'm really good at listening to what people have to say and incorporating it into a conversation. Own your good things and then build on those. Build on the things that you are good at so that your mental work is positive, as opposed to getting, again, stuck in these negative cycles as I'm not good enough and I'm not as good as person A or B or C.
You talk about designing that new voice. And when you're designing that voice, building that list, giving yourself the opportunity to create you instead of comparing yourself, that's going to require a couple experiments. And those experiments at times, they may get good results or they may get inconclusive results. And so for someone who's testing their theories out on what they want to be or how they want to dress or how they want to communicate and what that looks like to them, if they see the results as not the outcome that they wanted, what would you say to them so then they don't resort back to tearing themselves down?
Yeah, so change is very hard. There's no doubt about it. Change is very hard. If change wasn't so hard, we wouldn't have thousands and thousands of books about how to do it. So
Truth.
it
Yeah.
is a difficult thing to do. So again, I would start with your diagnosis, being very clear about what are you trying to do? What behavior or new skill or new development in yourself can you focus on? Because just do one at a time. You're not going to change yourself completely. So what's one thing? And break down what you're trying to change into one thing. And once you've got that one thing, you also want to look at what Keegan and Leahy call your immunity to change. What is it about that change that part of you is fighting against? What scares you about that change? And think about that a little bit. So, an example from my class is that one woman wanted to speak up more in a senior leadership team. But every time that there was conversation going on, she held back and she held back. And she went back and said, well, what scares her about that? Well, in her family, so you go back sometimes to family dynamics. In her family, she was taught never question authority. The seniors in her culture and her family, those are the people who were venerated. And so you didn't contradict, you didn't question anything that they had to say. So it was scary to think about doing that. So part of then is that, can you reframe? One of the things is, can you reframe that? So as opposed to I'm questioning authority or I'm thwarting authority, think about it more as I'm bringing my team's voice to senior leaders. I'm figuring out a way to get our perspective out on the table. And particularly for women, I know you have a lot of women in your audience. Sometimes advocating for yourself is very difficult. So make it about us, not about you. It's not about me having this. It's about me bringing the voice of my team. It's about me helping my team to get their voices heard. So make it more about others as opposed to yourself. And then, okay, you still want to work about getting to be more assertive in that senior leadership team. What you want to do is find a whole lot of role models, not just one, but a whole lot of role models. Find a number of different people who are assertive with senior leaders, but don't fall prey to all of the fears and hesitancies that you fall prey to. Who's doing this well? And then you become a detective. Well, what are they doing well? What is their tone of voice? How do they approach it? What's the first thing they say? When do they intervene? What's the timing of it? Get really, really clear. What are the words that they use? And different people will use different words and have different demeanors, which is why you want to look at multiple ones to say, what fits me the best? What works with who I am? And then you do those tests that you were talking about. So there's a lot of pre-work to running the test. But then when you're trying things out, so let's say you've got 3 role models and think of it as a wardrobe. You like the skirt of one and the hat of another and the shoes of another. So you're going to put that together and try those things on. Then you've got to sort of say, okay, I'm not going to go in and be a completely different person because people will look at me as, who is that person? But what are a few little things that you can try to build up momentum and confidence? So try a few things. How did people react? What did they say? How did they respond? So try a few things, get some feedback and say, okay, what's the next round look like? And the next round and the next round. So this woman who was super scared of saying anything, she goes, well, the first time I tried to say something, I sounded like an idiot and my boss was wondering what I did. And so one of the other classmates who was in her group said, yeah, one person questioned it, but other people came up afterwards and said it was really good to hear from you. So there was mixed feedback. Many people discount any positive feedback. They only believe the negative. And you want to write down all the feedback, not just the negative, also the positive. And so she had the energy and enthusiasm to keep going. And she had one role model that she really liked, call it Estelle. And so she just said, I'm in the meeting and I'm listening. And I really think that what this guy, this vice president is saying is wrong. And yeah, and then finally she was like, what would Estelle say? What would she say? How would she act? And she said, and then I'm channeling Estelle. And I got up and I said what I had to say. And then I sat down and I was so nervous and I got a lot of positive feedback in the end. So, which isn't to say that every foray is going to be successful. You just have to keep trying different things until you find one that fits.
Mm-hmm. Do women have to have more of a conscious effort around making those changes to be able to give themselves the bravado to be able to step into that? Does it come more naturally to men?
I don't know what the data are around men versus women. Certainly in my classes, I have men and women, and men are also struggling in a variety of ways. And they may have different ghosts that are operating. So it may be that they have the ghost of, you got to be the guy's guy, you got to be the all. And so for them, they get feedback that they have to listen more. That's very hard for them because, well, that takes away from my identity. I'm not going to be a strong leader if I listen. And then you have to say, well, you don't have to change your whole identity. You can be a strong leader who also listens. So don't shift your whole identity. Hold on to what's important to you and just add to it in small doses. So I would say, men have their demons as well.
The reason why I ask that is because I think we can get trapped in gender identity roles at times. And this gives us the opportunity to, instead of getting stuck as men versus women or trans at that point in time, that gives us an opportunity to say, no, how am I experiencing this personally? So then I can customize my experiments and I can be and do that detective work. And then now it is truly my unique experience instead of saying, okay, well, this is how it was done in the past. This is how I should be. And going back to exactly how we started the conversation of those should ghosts. So if there was anything that you wanted to leave with our listeners as that last little tidbit of someone who is struggling with that ghost, whether it's a good, a bad, however they've chosen to label it, what would you say to them?
I would say that, first of all, we all have ghosts. We all have demons. And that life is a process of working through and trying to conquer them one at a time. I would say start small with little steps. Spend time understanding who you are, what your voice is, and then you get to craft a life. You get to craft your leadership signature. You get to craft who you are. And that requires a lot of work. So you want to be who you are. I suggest to women very often choose female role models because they have understood a little bit more about what it is that they as women are going to experience as a result. But take a look at what a guy might be doing in the same instance. There may be things that you learn from them, but you have to keep in mind that what he does and what you do may be viewed differently. Even if you're doing the same thing, how it's viewed by the audience might be very different. So that's why you're just going to have to go into experimental mode and then pivot if it's not working. Try it out wherever you are. I mean, I'm very bad at asking for things, and my friend is amazing at it. So whenever she's in town, I'm just taking notes. So how does she do it? And part of me is I don't like to ask people always to cater to my needs. I believe in dealing mostly with my own needs. I should be better, but I don't want to be as much as she is. So, but I take notes anyway. And then I'm sort of like, oh, okay, I'm in the store and I'm buying something and I'm trying to return it. And the guy says that it's not returnable. I'm saying, okay, how do I channel my friend in this instance? This is a way to practice low stakes and see what that's like. So you can practice anywhere, practice with your kids, practice with your partner, practice whatever. It's always just keep on going. Don't get stuck in the trauma. Don't get stuck in the I can't do this. Don't get stuck in the I'm no good. Always push for what can we see that's positive and how do you build on that?
Deborah hit the nail on the head. You don't need to label everything. You really don't. Labeling can be detrimental if it keeps you stuck in a box thinking you are only that. This is one of the reasons when I talk about imposter syndrome, one of the first things I say is that it isn't a syndrome, because it's not. There is no true diagnosis for it, and it hasn't been established in the psychiatric manual. Originally coined imposter phenomenon, it is an experience, just like everything in our life. And those experiences leave us with good ghosts and bad ghosts based on how you choose to define them. Recently, I was giving a lecture to a group of CEO business coaches at a conference, and we talked about imposter syndrome. One person at the end came up to me and said, I really appreciate you telling us nothing is wrong with us and to just get over it. I literally can't do justice because it sounds super sarcastic by how he said it when he said, you just told us to get over it. But what he meant was just that. Stop labeling yourself because it tears you down. See it and then navigate through it. What made me laugh when I left that conversation is that I know I didn't use those exact words because it's not my style of communication, but it's this individual who interpreted and reminded me that this is how each and every single one of us moves throughout life. We interpret based on our understanding, our experiences, what we're feeling, who's in the room, and how we take in information. All of those things play a role. So one word, one label doesn't actually define you. Just like Deborah said, she wanted to be that cool person. But what's your definition of cool? It isn't just one label, so go out and be your version of cool. And if you need inspiration, look to others to craft that persona, that life, whatever it is. Use others as example and take pieces from everywhere and put your puzzle together. Okay, key takeaways from today. Number 1, familial dynamics affect your worldview, and it's time to reframe it. You can choose to live in a closed-off place, but you can also choose to expand beyond. Our families give us a point of view or perspective of the world, but it doesn't have to be the only point of view. And if that worldview for you has been hard and comes with bad ghosts, you can figure out how to reframe it so it doesn't affect how you choose to lead. Our parents or caregivers give us our first instructional ways on how to communicate. And it is easy to mirror those ways once we are in leadership roles. But the beauty of instructional ways is that we can learn many different styles of leadership and hone it to fit the leader you want to be. Number 2, you can balance success and avoid perfectionism. For those of you that don't know, I was a huge perfectionist. I actually call myself a recovering perfectionist because there are still moments in time I have to catch myself. Perfectionism was extremely bad for me because it made me rigid and inflexible. It didn't give the opportunity to problem solve or critically think because I was so damn afraid I would make a mistake. I wasn't excited for the success. In fact, I feared failure. And you know what that got me? A whole lot of acid reflux, Tums, and needing my stomach lining biopsy. Oh wait, and add on insomnia. That's the kicker. The actual definition of perfectionism includes negative health side effects. Thus, I'm a recovering perfectionist. One of the reasons I demanded perfection was because then that meant the outcome or results would be certain. And if it was certain, then I could demand perfection. And if it was perfect, then I knew I would be happy and feel successful. Talk about a domino effect. But striving for perfection never made me happy and negated any of my success. That is why I challenge you today and every day moving forward to redefine perfection, which then has you redefining happiness and success. Those three things are way more interconnected than you realize, especially as a high achiever. Okay, every episode will have a reflection question, and this is yours for today. How can you reframe your bad ghost into a good ghost? Or if that question doesn't sit well with you, even if you experienced a bad ghost, what did it teach you about you? When you found your answer, send me a DM on Instagram or an email to info@drjessicametcalfe.com. That's info@drjessicametcalfe.com. Thank you so much for joining us today on this episode. Remember, when you hear your inner gremlin, ask yourself, would I say this to a loved one? And if your answer is no, then it's time for a reframe. Speak kindly. You're listening.